Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for tonight's debate. The motion before the House tonight is this House believes the union with Scotland is salvageable, and we have an expert lineup to debate this. To just go through the format for tonight, the way this will work with 4 speakers on either side is that we will have the first pair of speakers speaking. I will then open it out to everyone in the room, upstairs and downstairs, to make a point from the floor either in proposition, opposition, or abstention of the motion. If you want to make a point in abstention, this can be a question about the motion itself, or perhaps if you're undecided at that point, something that you really hope that the rest of the speakers can address. We will then return to the debate and have the next 2 pairs of speakers, and then a second opportunity for a floor round before the final pair of speakers speak. The other opportunity for you to get involved tonight is to intervene during a speaker's speech. You can do this by making a point of information, by saying point of information on that point, or kind of indicating. Again, you need to really make sure that you respect the speaker's time, and they may decline, they may just keep on speaking, and there will be a subsequent chance, hopefully, in the floor round. With both of these opportunities to take part, please do try and keep your point to 30 seconds or fewer, and also do wait for a microphone so that both other people in the chamber and especially the speakers can hear you, but also so that everyone watching online, and we have got quite a few watching online tonight, can also hear the point that you make. Without further ado, we will move to the debate. Our first speaker tonight is Sir Malcolm Rifkind. Malcolm is the former Foreign Secretary and Secretary of State for Scotland. Malcolm, the floor is yours.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, it is a very great privilege for a mere graduate of Edinburgh University to come to this august establishment and be received as almost as an equal, not quite, but almost as an equal, by the undergraduates of Cambridge University. The subject this evening is one of very great significance, very great importance. I remember hearing that when Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden, never to return, that as they left the Garden of Eden, Adam turned to Eve and said, "You know, my dear, we are living in an age of transition." We are living in an age of transition at this moment, very relevant to the subject of this evening's debate. Because it's not just in the United Kingdom that you have the issue of Scottish nationalism and whether the United Kingdom will survive as a kingdom. We've seen in Catalonia and Spain a similar challenge. We see it in other parts of Europe. It is part of the situation that we now face. But we shouldn't imagine that all these circumstances are the same. Each country is different, and the likely historical development will be different as well. I took part, as I'm sure some of my colleagues on both sides did, in the Scottish referendum 2 or 3 years ago. And I have a marvelous recollection of one evening when I'd been invited to address a public meeting in Helensburgh in the west of Scotland. And there was about 300 people packed into the hall, including people in the balcony. And when we got to questions after my speech, a chap in the balcony said, "I want to ask a question from Sir Malcolm Rifkind. I should introduce myself. I am the chairman of the Scottish Jacobite Society." And he then went on to ask what was obviously a pro-nationalist, a pro-SNP question. So when it came to me to answer it, I said, "Well, before I answer your question, you informed us that you're president or chairman of the Scottish Jacobite Society. You do realize Bonnie Prince Charlie never wanted to be King of Scotland. He wanted to be King of the United Kingdom." And so it was a great cheer from the crowd, most of whom were on the unionist side. And the guy tried to come back to ask a supplementary. So I said, "Yes, let him ask his supplementary," thinking it would be hostile. And he said, "Mr. Rifkind, I've just been listening to what you said. You're right, you know, he was a unionist." And now, we are not debating these matters in a vacuum. We are debating these matters 2 or 3 years after the Scottish people decided by a pretty healthy majority they did want to remain part of the United Kingdom, and they wanted to have nothing to do with a separate Scottish state. And so we're quite different already from the circumstances in Catalonia and Spain. I'm not going to enter into that dispute. But there, for good reasons or bad, the Catalans have not yet had the opportunity to express a view. In Scotland, we have had that view. And Scotland, by 55% to 45%, took a decision. And it's precisely because of that decision that the nationalists suffered a massive defeat at the last general election in the United Kingdom. They used to tease the Tories in Scotland when we were down to our bare minimum, saying there are more pandas in Edinburgh Zoo than there are Tory MPs in Scotland. Well, I'm happy to say now there are more pandas in Edinburgh Zoo than there are SNP members in the northeast of Scotland. I happily give way.
Would you have said the SNP winning 35 seats in Scotland constituted a massive defeat for them in the 2017 election?
Put it this way, it was the same sort of defeat as Theresa May had in the House of Commons. She also won the election, but because the result was a lot less satisfactory than she'd started off with, it has been universally described as indeed a significant defeat. So I'm happy to respond to that particular point. Now, the point I want to make, which I think is of crucial importance, is to go back to the origins of our union. Because you have some circumstances where a country resents, a minority resent being in a country they never wish to be in, they never belong to, but they are there because of oppression. In the United Kingdom's case, you could say that about Southern Ireland. That was their experience. They were conquered, they were absorbed against their wishes. Scotland and England are in a quite different situation. We have shared a monarch since 1603. And that wasn't when the King of England became King of Scotland. That was the other way around. The King of Scotland actually became King of England. And from 1707, we have shared a United Kingdom Parliament, both before devolution and in recent years after devolution. And the reason why that union took place is relevant today. There were different reasons in England and Scotland for voting for the union. The English were terrified that the Scots wouldn't accept the Hanoverian monarchs and might go back to having a Stuart king, and Scotland would become a foreign country. But the Scots voted for the union, various reasons, but the single most important reason was they wanted access to England's trade. Not just in England, but the English Empire in North America and India and elsewhere. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It was called what we call today a single market. And they knew then that a small, poor country like Scotland, unless it had the opportunity to share the internal market of the United Kingdom, as it became, would suffer, and indeed the opposite happened. They prospered and have never ceased prospering from that union, which makes it all the more absurd when the nationalists say that they want an independent Scotland to join Europe, to be part of the European single market. But of course, by doing so, after Brexit, they will cease to be part of the United Kingdom single market. There will be a hard border on the Scottish-English border, which would be ludicrous given that 2/3 of Scottish exports actually go to other parts of the United Kingdom. But it's not just these grounds that are relevant. Because when the union took place, the separate identity of Scotland was not ignored, it was respected. The Church of Scotland as a separate church, our universities, our legal system. I am a Scottish barrister, a Scottish advocate. I am not able to practice in the English courts. English barristers cannot practice in the Scottish courts because we have a different legal system. Our churches are different. But the Church of Scotland and the Church of England are established churches. The Queen is a member of both. The difference is, somebody said, what is the difference? In England, the Queen is the head of the Church of England. The head of the Church of Scotland is God. The Queen is a member when she crosses the border. So the union has been sensitive to these cultural and national differences in a way that the nationalists conveniently ignore whenever it suits them. And it is very foolish of them to do so. But my arguments and the arguments of my colleagues for the union, and why not only the union is salvageable, it's already been salvaged as a result of our referendum. That's the only issue I take with the motion, Madam President. But the reason for the union is much more than economics or trade. There's an idealistic reason as well. Because what the United Kingdom represents, we've been a very lucky country, perhaps, a lucky island. There is nowhere in the world that has had some 300 to 400 years of internal peace without a civil war. The last time we had internal conflict was 1745, the Jacobite Rising. Since then, we have had uninterrupted internal peace so far as England, Scotland, and Wales are concerned. And what message would we be sending to the world, which is full of division and fragmentation and occasional civil wars and conflict, if we were to say that the Scots and the English and the Welsh, who have lived so peacefully together for 300 years, now have so little in common that they have decided to go their own separate ways? Does that really represent an example to the wider world? And are the nationalists actually seriously saying to us that while they are happy by being part of a European Union that has supranational legislation, which has a European Court of Justice, which has a European Parliament and European government in prototype, that they're happy to share their sovereignty, but they share so little in common with our fellow citizens in England and Wales that the idea of sharing a United Kingdom, which in the eyes certainly of the rest of the world has been an enormous success for 300 years, has so little to commend itself. The quicker we get out, the better. And the economic arguments are, if they had any substance in the past, which they didn't, are now manifestly absurd. The whole basis of the Scottish nationalist appeal at the time of the referendum was the oil industry, that somehow this would mean that what would otherwise be a country that could not afford the public expenditure on health and housing and other public services. Yes, by all means.
Are you aware of the research by the Fraser of Allender Institute that shows the biggest threat to the Scottish economy at present is Brexit, and if Scotland leaves under the current model of Brexit, people will lose on average £2,000 of wages per annum and 80,000 jobs will be lost in Scotland? Are you seriously suggesting that's a bright and rosy prospect for Scotland?
I'm saying it's an incredibly brighter prospect than what you yourself are advocating, which is Scotland separating itself from the internal market of the rest of the United Kingdom, separating ourselves from where 70% of Scottish exports go, at a time when the oil industry is producing for government a tiny revenue compared to what the nationalists were claiming would be available to a Scottish government at the time of the referendum. If the nationalists had won that referendum, Scotland would now have a massive hole in its budgetary requirements, and the nationalists have not yet either acknowledged how incompetent they were in their predictions, nor how they would intend to fill that gap. And I look forward when the Honourable Lady makes her speech, perhaps answering that point. Do you accept you got it wrong in a massive way, and that Scotland now would be suffering enormously if it was an independent state with 5% of the revenues from oil that the nationalists were predicting? You don't have to answer it now. You'll have plenty of time to give this House the information. No, I'd rather using your time, not mine, in order to deal with that. Let me draw my remarks to a conclusion by just making a couple of other final points, if I may. Because the arguments for the Union are partly idealistic, the peace and harmony that at least I acknowledge the separate problems of Ireland, but so far as Scotland, England and Wales are concerned, which is what we're discussing this evening, it has been an enormous success story and one we can be proud of and still relevant. The economic arguments have become overwhelming, particularly in the light of the collapse of oil, which is not going to come back because the oil is gradually being depleted in any event. But there's also the simple geopolitical and geographical fact that we are an island. One of the reasons why we have been so fortunate, not clever, fortunate, why fate has been kind to us, is that when you are an island, it fosters common values, common language, and a common identity. And the unique value of the United Kingdom is that that has been combined with diversity. It's my very final point, that the being part of a United Kingdom has not eliminated the Scottish identity or the Welsh or the English identity. It has been able to reconcile unity where it matters with diversity where it is crucial for cultural, social, and other reasons. And that's true in the past. It's even more true now, when Scotland has its parliament, Wales has its assembly, and the English are devolving within England to the regions of England. So I strongly recommend and encourage you not just to support this motion, but to do so not just in your head, but in your heart as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Sir Malcolm for opening for the proposition. And now to our first speaker on side opposition. Joanna Cherry has been the MP for Edinburgh South West since 2015 and is also the SNP Justice and Home Affairs spokesperson. Joanna, the floor is yours.
Well, good evening, Madam President, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to be here on what is, in fact, my first visit to Cambridge. My father, who's an Oxford graduate, always refers to this place as that Fenland Academy. But as an Edinburgh graduate, I don't share my father's prejudices, and I have to say, from what little I've seen of Cambridge already, it's every bit as august and handsome as I was always led to believe, and I'm very grateful for the generous hospitality we've received this evening. It's a pleasure to be part of this debate this evening. It's a particular pleasure for me to debate with Sir Malcolm, as both he and I are part of a long line of members of the Faculty of Advocates, that's the Scottish Bar, who have represented the seat which I now represent in Edinburgh South West, which was previously the seat of Edinburgh Pentlands. Sir Malcolm was the last Conservative and Unionist to represent that seat, and I am the first Scottish nationalist to represent that seat. I've also continued the constituency's proud tradition of being represented by senior council. The Edinburgh South West has been represented by senior council since the 1950s, apart from a brief fall from grace when it was represented by that well-known junior council, Alistair Darling. But I like to think that the progression of Edinburgh South West through Conservative, Labour, and to me, a Scottish National Party MP, indicates the political progression of modern Scotland, and indeed it indicates why I'm opposing this motion tonight. Because, ladies and gentlemen, I truly do believe that the union with Scotland is not salvageable. Now, Sir Malcolm has spoken about the referendum of 2014, but Sir Malcolm, that was then, and this is now. The no won by 10% in 2014, and some people thought that the issue would be settled for a generation. But subsequent tumultuous events in British politics have proved that the issue will not go away, not because I say so, but because the people of Scotland say so. The party which I represent has continued to flourish since the 2014 referendum. In 2015, we got 50% of the vote in Scotland in the general election, and because of our ridiculous first-past-the-post system, 56 out of the 59 MPs. Now, Malcolm represents our setback earlier this year as a huge setback, but what he doesn't tell you is that we won the election in Scotland earlier this year, and we still have 35 out of the 59 MPs. That is more than all the other parties put together. So the Scottish National Party are still the majority party representing Scotland at Westminster. My colleagues, I'll take your point in a moment, sir. My colleagues in Edinburgh won their third term in office last year with 46.5% of the vote. That is the highest popular mandate of any governing party in Europe at present. I'll take your point of information, sir.
As you just pointed out, we have a ridiculous first-past-the-post system. So whilst the Nationalists did get the most votes at the general election and got a majority of the seats, did they get an absolute majority of the votes, or was that the Unionist parties?
Well, you see, you misunderstand my point there completely. We're operating under the current system. The Scottish Parliament does have a proportional system, and yet we've won our third consecutive victory there. And together with the Green members of the Scottish Parliament, there are a majority of proportionally elected members of the Scottish Parliament in favour of independence and in favour of holding another independence referendum. So, I will in a moment. So there will be another independence referendum because it's a simple matter of democracy. The majority of MSPs, members of the Scottish Parliament, represent parties who want independence and want another independence referendum. Very happy to take your point.
I'm very grateful to Joanna Cherry taking an intervention. Would you like to comment on whether the polls in Scotland are indicating that the public would like to have a second referendum and whether there is an increasing vote in favour of independence?
I think nobody wants a second independence referendum at the moment. In the same way,
Indeed.
at the moment, in the same way that nobody wants a second EU referendum. Nobody wanted a general election earlier this year. Voters in Scotland and the UK are sick to the back teeth of going to the polls and holding referendums. But more importantly, as the Honourable Lady knows, people in Scotland don't want to leave the European Union, and there will come a point, and Mr Coburn rolls his eyes to heaven. It's called democracy, Mr Coburn. 62% of people who voted to stay in the European Union. And you see, this is democracy in action. The fact that the issue of Scottish independence is not going away is not an irritant for those who don't like it. It's a matter it's a matter of democracy. Now, I'm going to make a little bit of progress before I take any more points. As to whether a second independence referendum will be held, my answer is yes, because the Scottish Parliament wants to hold one, and that's democracy. As to whether it will be won, my answer is yes. If it's held at the right time, it will be won. Because you see, ladies and gentlemen, Madam President, you can fool the people once, but you can't fool the people twice. Now, sadly, we don't have any... I'm going to make some progress. Sadly, we don't have any Liberal Democrats here tonight. But this is why... Well, I was rather hoping to have a Liberal Democrat on my team, because I like a cross-party approach. But the Liberal Democrats are very keen on the idea of a second EU referendum because they, like many of us, are outraged about the lies and misrepresentation of the Leave campaign. I know everyone's sick of hearing about it, but the £350 million promised to the NHS. And you see, the difficulty is, once you have made promises which are then broken, or once you have told untruths in order to win a referendum, it's very unlikely that the same promises and the same untruths will hold the sway a second time round. And,
I'm going to say at this point that if points of intervention now could come in the first floor round, please. I can take multiple ones, but I think so we continue the debate. Joanna.
I'm delighted to see such interest in my points. I'll be very happy to contribute in the floor discussion, but I'd like to take the little time I have to develop my argument, because I realise that many people in this room will not have been present in Scotland during the independence referendum and may not understand the reality of what occurred. A number of promises, very crucial promises, were made to the Scots. Because you see, much of what Sir Malcolm says is right. Scotland's not comparable to Ireland. Scotland has enjoyed many benefits over the years from the Union. But Scotland does not at present enjoy an equal partnership. In fact, it would be impossible for the 5 million Scots to be in an equal partnership with the 55 million English. It wouldn't really ever work. But yet, during the referendum, I think the chair has made a ruling, and I'll continue. During the referendum, Scotland was told, you are an equal partner in the Union. An equal partner in the Union by many people on the Better Together. And I truly believe that they believed that was true at the time. But events subsequent to that have shown it is not the case. I know this because I sit in Westminster and have done for the last 2.5 years. Day after day, the wishes and the votes of the majority of Scottish MPs, and I don't just mean me and my colleagues, I mean Labour MPs and Lib Dems and sometimes the odd Tory rebel, and I'm really delighted we're going to have a Scottish Tory rebel on Brexit. Even the odd Tory rebel, and yet they are ridden over roughshod, it being an inevitable result of the arithmetic in the British Parliament, that the Scots cannot impose their will on the English, but the English and other parts of the UK are able to impose their will on us because of the arithmetic, so it's not an equal union. During the Scotland Bill, that was the bill that was supposed to give Scottish Parliament more powers after 2014, not one single amendment proposed by the Scottish National Party was passed. Think about it. 56 out of 59 MPs, 50% of the vote, yet not one of our amendments to that bill were passed. Is that an equal partner? I don't think so. Another crucial broken promise of the Better Together campaign: the only way to save your EU citizenship is to vote to stay part of the UK. Well, as a famous American shrink said, how's that working for you now? 62% of Scots voted to remain in the EU referendum, yet we are being taken out of the European Union against our will. The Scottish Government almost a year ago put forward a very sensible compromise proposal. I invite you to all go home and have a look at it, called Scotland's Place in Europe, which proposed that the United Kingdom, which failing Scotland, could stay in the single market. That has been treated as a joke by the British government. Scotland has no seat at the negotiation table and no voice in the European negotiations. And you know, we in Scotland sometimes look rather enviously at our near neighbour Ireland, a country with a much weaker economy than Scotland, but a country which sits at the top table in Europe, is famous for its expansionist presidencies in the European Union, and has been able to dictate red lines for the negotiations between the EU 27 and the United Kingdom. Red lines about the border, which are the border between the north and the south of Ireland, which are so crucial, they will probably lead to the breakdown of the negotiations. That's the power of a small country at the heart of Europe, and it's the power that Scotland would like to have. And it leads me to a very common mistake made by Sir Malcolm. Sir Malcolm says, if England Brexits, and I'm talking to my English friends, I very much doubt that's going to happen now, but if they do, if they're foolish enough to do it, if England Brexit and Scotland becomes independent, there will be a hard border. Why then, Sir Malcolm, does your chum David Davis tell us constantly that when the Republic of Ireland's in the single market and the north of Ireland isn't, there won't have to be a hard border between the north and the south of Ireland? It's nonsense. It's nonsense. It's always been in England and Scotland's interest to trade together, and we will always be able to do that. I very much hope that the English will see sense, give up on Brexit, and that we will remain equal partners in the European Union, just as Ireland is an equal partner with the United Kingdom. You see, because Sir Malcolm, and probably others who speak tonight, like to sometimes give the impression that Scottish nationalism is some narrow thing. But it's always been a very outward-looking thing. Not many people know this, but after William Wallace won the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, the very first thing he did was to sit down and write a letter to the Hanseatic League, which was the precursor at that time, the medieval, if you like, version of the European Union, to say there has been a change at the top in Scotland and we want to trade with you. Now, people may chuckle. Of course, it's very different. You cannot make any comparison between the medieval economy and the modern economy. But the point is, when the Scots were in charge of their own destiny, they looked outward, just as they did when they wrote the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320, when they wrote to the Pope saying, we want to be recognised as an independent nation. Please recognise us as such. And that document is the founding document upon which the Declaration of Independence in America was modelled. Scotland was for many years in an alliance with the French. I was in Paris last week with the Exiting the EU Select Committee, having meetings with senators and members of the Assemblée Nationale. And they're always very warm towards the Scots, because we remember that 450 years ago we shared a queen, and we also shared great trade and exchange of ideas. Edinburgh, the city which I represent, was the cradle of the Enlightenment, which spread out across Europe. And our separate legal system, which Sir Malcolm has referred to, has often looked to European civilian models of law rather than just to the common law system. But I, as a Scots lawyer, like to think we take the best of both. We take the best of the common law and the best of civilian law. So don't be duped this evening into thinking that those of us who want to see an independent Scotland want to put up a hard border and spend the rest of our time in kilts, handsome as the gentlemen this evening in their kilts do look. This is an outward-looking nationalism. We simply want to be an equal partner in the European Union. The policy of the Scottish National Party for many years has been to be an independent country in Europe, and our policy is to remain a member of NATO. In our independence referendum, the Scottish Government allowed EU citizens living and working in Scotland to vote, unlike the EU referendum where the UK government disenfranchised our EU neighbours. So, ladies and gentlemen, if I can just finish by saying this, I'm half Irish, and the day after the independence referendum in Scotland, one of my Irish uncles phoned me to express his astonishment that the Scots had voted no to independence. And he was really very perplexed, and he said to me, you Scots must be the first nation on the face of this earth to do that. And I said, well, I don't know if that's right or not, Oliver, I said, But you've got to understand that many Scots still feel very invested in the union with England. Ireland's national struggle is not a model for Scotland. And I explained, just as Sir Malcolm has said, that many Scots feel that they have over the years benefited from the union with England. But you see, the reason why I'm opposing this motion tonight is because those benefits and that respect agenda, which was spoken about so much during the independence referendum in 2014, is under threat, mainly from Brexit. And it's not just that we're leaving the European Union against the wishes of Scottish voters. It's also that the EU referendum bill is being designed in such a way that many of the powers that come back from Brussels will go to Westminster, even in areas such as agriculture and fisheries, which were devolved to Scotland in 1998. And this is very important because whatever you think about independence, there is massive support for the devolved settlement in Scotland. 75% of Scots voted for it in 1998. And recent polls show that 80% of Scots support the idea of devolution. People made a big song and dance about how exciting it was that 20% of Scots want to abolish the Scottish Parliament. But I think the fact that 80% of Scots support it gives a pretty resounding judgment. So we look at the risk of those powers being taken away from us, and we also look at the fact that Scotland's economy and society, our great universities, our flourishing food and drink industry, our flourishing renewable industry, our flourishing life sciences sector, are all under severe economic threat as a result of Brexit. Don't take it from me as a nationalist, take it from the assessment of independent bodies. I put some figures from the Fraser of Allender Institute to Sir Malcolm earlier. He wasn't able to deal with them. I managed to secure from David Davis at the Exiting the EU Select Committee a couple of weeks ago a promise that the assessment of the impact of Brexit will be shared with the Scottish Government. But by God, believe me, they will do everything to prevent the public from seeing that. So, the reason I believe that the union between Scotland and England is not salvageable is because 3 years ago, it was saved on the back of promises that have been fundamentally broken. And the Scots will at some point, I hope, in the not-too-distant future, vote to protect our economy, our society, our exchange of goods and ideas with the rest of Europe from the narrow direction that, sadly, others wish to take the United Kingdom in. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Joanna Cherry for opening for side opposition. And now we will go to the floor round. I will take multiple points in proposition, opposition, and abstention. Please do remember to try and keep them to 30 seconds and under, and to wait for a microphone before you make them. So first of all, are there any points in proposition of the motion? I think I will take one here, and then one just on the second row, and one in the red top there. So starting just on the front row here. You may give your name and institution for the record.
Gabriel Barton Singer, Trinity College, and more importantly for Joanna, Lib Dem. Thank you. I was summoned and I appeared, but it's interesting, you mentioned the mandates of the people of Scotland, and you mentioned how they chose to vote to remain in the EU. It's interesting you wish to respect that mandate, but not the mandate back in 2014 to remain a part of the UK. Why not respect both mandates? Why can't the whole country stay in the EU and stay in the UK? Because it's the same debate. It's about whether our nationhood is simple. We can only be one thing. We can only be English or Scottish. We can only be from London or from Britain. We can only be European or of our one nation. But it's not about that. The whole point of union and the whole question of whether union is salvageable is about whether identities can be complex and whether we can exist in more than one identity at any one time. And it seems to me that it's possible that any union, the European Union, the union with Scotland, the union with Northern Ireland, the union with Wales, all these are salvageable if we can in this chamber decide that we believe our identities can be more complex than just one thing and more than just one place. And if we understand that fundamental question, and if we believe in that fundamental idea, we should vote with the proposition tonight that this union is salvageable and that many others are, and that the good arguments made by Joanna Cherry and the good arguments made by Malcolm Rifkind are reconcilable and that all these unions can be saved if we choose to vote with the proposition. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I think we have a second point just here.
Peter Hunt, Trinity Hall. I agree with your point. Sorry. I agree with your point. It was a very good point. If we stay together, we stay together. If we stay in the European Union, we stay together. If we leave the European Union, we have to leave together. The deadline's 2019. We cannot have another referendum on Scottish independence before then. Therefore, Scotland will leave the European Union with the rest of the United Kingdom. So Scotland will have left the European Union, and the European Union has made it abundantly clear that they will not allow an independent Scotland back in. So if we stay together, we stay together. If we leave together, we leave together. Thank you.
There is a right of reply for both sides if there are any brief comments that you do want to make in response to any of the points raised. I think we'll go to the final point in proposition, and then we'll move to opposition points.
Jamie Sykes, Fitzwilliam. I'd like to point out to Ms Cherry that it is not a democracy of regions that we have in either the EU or the UK. It is a democracy of individuals. I'm sure the Tory heartlands have been, their wishes have been run roughshod over in past years, for example, the Blairite government. And in those years, Scotland would have found its wishes respected and voted with. Every single region has periods where its wishes on a single topic aren't respected, because that is the nature of being in a democracy. It happens in Scotland. The wishes of Edinburgh will not coincide with the wishes of those in the Highlands. It happens in all democracies, and we must respect that it is a democracy of individuals in the country, not of regions of the country. Thank you.
And we'll now move to any points that would like to be made in opposition of the motion. I think we have one just in the back corner there, and then a second one down here. If we start here, as you have the microphone first.
Thank you, Madam President. Richard Parkins, Trinity College. I would like to thank Sir Malcolm Rifkind for making a very good and very convincing speech to the motion that this House thinks that the union with Scotland should be salvaged. Unfortunately, the motion before us is that this House thinks the union with Scotland can be salvaged. And we have heard from our friend on the opposition precisely why it can't. Because as soon as the Scottish Nationalist Party loses a referendum, they promptly find reasons why circumstances has changed and they want another one. And they'll keep doing this until they win one.
Thank you. And then I think we've got a second point just over here.
Thank you. Samuel Longton, Peterhouse. I'm going to speak for a silent minority in Cambridge, those who did support Brexit. There are some of us around. And why Brexiteers should want Scotland to leave the Union is because 60 votes in Parliament will go, which are going to try and keep us from Brexit. You know, actually, if we have Scotland leave, unfortunately, Brexit becomes far more likely, and a hard Brexit becomes far more likely if you are keen on that. So, hard Brexiteers, you know which way to go.
And then I think we have a third point just on the second row there.
Thank you very much. Pastor Tonkaboni, Girton College Law. So basically, isn't the conduct of the Conservative government at the moment basically ignoring all the constitutional conventions, the Sewell conventions, and giving hollow and empty promises to the Scottish government that the devolved administrations will be considered in the process and their views will be taken into account when deciding which Brexit strategy to adopt a soft Brexit strategy? Why is the Conservative government constantly ignoring Scottish views and not adopting a more compromising line in trying to take into account the fact that 2 nations in the United Kingdom voted to leave and 2 nations voted to remain within the European Union. Isn't that total ignorance of different nations voting in different ways, undermining the Union?
Thank you. And then finally, we're going to move to points in abstention of the motion. Would anyone like to raise a point in abstention at all? It looks like we have 3 over here, so just in the orange jumper there, and then 2 people on the row behind as well. If you just want to start in the 3rd row.
Very well. My name is Hugo, and I come from an heathen island of the North Atlantic, Portugal, a country with a very long-standing alliance with the United Kingdom for around 7 centuries, and why I think everyone here should be in abstention, even why usually abstention points are about people who are confused. It's for a very simple reason. Scotland and the Scottish people do not care about what the UK does. That's what Portugal has been doing for the past 7 centuries, and everything will be fine. Your country will be sunnier, your wine will be better, likewise for your beer. You will be very bad at debating competitions, but tourism will be improving, you will not be wearing skirts, and overall, I think that your sense of humor will also improve. Just that.
Thank you, and then just the point over there.
I have to say I'm very torn, and also I know I don't sound it, but I am Scottish, so I have a deep involvement in this debate. And the practical case, the economic case that stood in 2014 and stands even stronger now is incredibly convincing. But the emotional case that the first speaker on the proposition tried to make has become more confused. His emotional argument for the union could perhaps be described as united in diversity. That also happens to be the motto of the EU. It seems like that vision of diversity is exactly what the United Kingdom is turning its back on now. And for that reason, I am torn between the hard-headed economic case and the future direction of the UK, which seems sort of united against the outside world, united against diversity. Thank you.
And then finally, we had a point, I think it's this point here on the end.
Daniel McKinnon, Queens. The proposition made a very good point about why it's good for Scotland to stay in the Union, but there hasn't been any point as to why it's good for England for Scotland to stay in the Union. I was wondering if one of the sides would address this.
Okay, well, excellent. Thank you for all those points in the floor round there. Hopefully, as we return now to 3 more pairs of speakers, some of those points can be addressed as well. Returning to side proposition, our second speaker this evening is David Coburn. David is the leader of Scottish UKIP and an MEP for the Scotland constituency and has been since 2014. David, the floor is yours.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honoured to be here at the alma mater of those great Englishmen, Philby, Burgess and Maclean. And I would like to say that I'm a great fan of England. I've spent many of my years, formative years here, at university in Leeds, and I love England as much as I love Scotland. So I just like to make that clear. The tide of public opinion in Scotland is turning. The last general election showed us that the SNP were not as popular as they thought they were. Scotland's separation from the United Kingdom seems to be the SNP's only policy, and Scots have found it wanting. The SNP have destroyed one of the finest education systems in the world. I'm losing my phone. They have damaged the Scottish economy by creating uncertainty about Scotland's direction as a nation. Yes.
Don't you think that the real damage being done to Scotland's economy, and indeed the whole of the United Kingdom's economy at present, is by the uncertainty that those of your ilk have caused by procuring the Brexit vote?
No, because the majority of people voted to leave the European Union. And we voted as a United Kingdom and not as Scotland. And when Scotland voted against independence, they also at the same time knew there was a forthcoming vote on the European Union, and they voted nonetheless in favour of the Union. More people voted for the Union than voted for the other. Anyway, the SNP have destroyed one of the finest education systems in the world. They've damaged...
Tell these people...
Would you
like to tell people the evidential basis for saying the SNP have destroyed the educational system in Scotland? What's your evidence for that, Mr Coburn?
Well, their latest ideas are not ones I would approve of. They don't believe in competition. They don't believe in the reading, writing, and arithmetic. All they're interested in is character building and odd sort of weird ideas that have nothing to do with teaching children to read, write, and add up. Quite frankly, that's what people want their children to be able to do. Well, the uncertainty of our direction as a nation and also the nature of Scotland's currency. This is doing tremendous damage to any form of investment in Scotland. It's catastrophic. Despite calling themselves Scottish nationalists, the Scottish nationalists are nothing of the sort. I am a Scottish patriot, which means I could never be a Scottish nationalist. Scotland's best interests lie in a 300-year-old alliance with the rest of the United Kingdom. Scotland's alliance with England enabled both nations to punch above their respective weights. Both nations were insignificant in many ways in the world before the Union, and after Great Britain took the rule of law and democracy to the furthest corners of the globe. Neither Scotland nor England could ever have done this on their own. England is Scotland's biggest market. 60% and more of our exports go there. It's our biggest customer and the largest opportunity for Scots to find jobs south of the border. I can tell you, I was one of them. When Scotland had no jobs in the 70s, I went south like many of my schoolmates. So England is a great opportunity for Scots who then go home and start businesses. The SNP's constant baiting of England to achieve their independence fetish has severely damaged our relationship and the Scottish business. Jobs have been lost. Scots are not as well thought of in the south as they used to be, and no wonder with the SNP's behaviour. This was not the reason the Scottish Parliament was created. The Parliament was created to fill a perceived democratic deficit. Secretaries of State for Scotland were perceived to be less democratic, and of course they were. Too often they were seen as viceroys. Holyrood was created with a view to working in harmony with the Westminster Parliament, but the Scottish nationalists have simply used it as a battering ram to achieve their goal of independence. This has created a major... Let me make a little... Oh, well, sorry, fine.
Would you have said, is it all... do you support the actual creation of the Holyrood Parliament, or is it all just the SNP's fault for using it as this battering ram to do all these nasty things?
I'm coming to that. This has created a major constitutional problem, which was never intended when the Scottish Parliament was reconvened after an absence of a couple of hundred years. Scots, sick of SNP misrule, threw out several of the SNP's biggest beasts at the last general election. Angus Robertson, Alex Salmond, and my honourable opponent, Tasmina. This is a sign that the Scottish political tide is turning. And when the tide went out in the northeast of Scotland, the Scottish National Party's big beasts were perceived to be not wearing any bathing costumes. Despite their braggadocio, the Scots separation, about Scots' preferred wish of separation to sound economics, jobs, and education, the Scottish nationalist leadership got their P45s from the Scots who had previously received theirs. Tasmina.
Very much indeed. I understand that the Honourable Gentleman is leader of the United Kingdom International Party in Scotland. Can I ask more member? Independence Party. Can I ask how many seats your party won in the election in Scotland?
Well, I can tell you, it's the same thing happened with the Liberal Democrats. What happened was that people voted to make sure... We have a panda in the room. Can I just, let me just finish with, as you know, I'm happy to say. Basically, people wanted to make sure the Scottish nationalists lost their majority. They wanted the Scot Nats out. So they voted strategically to get them out. And a lot of votes, which might have come to my party, went to the Conservatives. And I quite understand that.
How many seats then did UKIP win in the previous Scottish election, or indeed the previous general election, or the Scottish parliamentary election before that?
Well, as I said before, well, we haven't won anything, but I tell you what I did do is beat you to get a seat in the European Parliament, so what can I say? And that was despite Alex Salmond going all over the country trying to get you in, so, you know, I think I did rather well with that. My Liberal panda.
Thank you. There are, I understand, it's only one panda in the end result, maybe it's two, but there are 4 Lib Dem MPs in Scotland. We've quadrupled our number of MPs, which is absolutely magnificent. So the claim that we got squeezed by vote is not true at all. A great many people in Scotland chose to support the Liberal Democrats because the majority of people in Scotland want to be part of the UK and part of the EU.
Well,
thank you.
Not entirely, because the other person's seat I took was a Liberal Democrat seat. So I'm afraid I took away the last Liberal Democrat seat in the European Parliament for Scotland. So maybe not. Okay, the Scots need and want jobs, and that cannot be achieved if the Scottish Parliament sets taxes higher than the rest of the United Kingdom. People will not sit about like capercaillies to be plucked by a rapacious, incompetent Scottish government with daft and expensive notions about business and expensive, illiberal, authoritarian policies such as the Named Person Act, which even the European Court of Justice found distasteful and authoritarian, and that says something. May I just finish? A commissar for every child and every home in Scotland. People are best placed to bring up their children, not the state. And I don't think we want any more of that.
Thank you. It's very gracious to take my point of information, particularly as I'm going to tell him that the named person case hasn't been anywhere near the European Court of Justice. It was the United Kingdom Supreme Court who said that the principle of the scheme was fine, yet procedural aspects required to be tightened up. I'm very happy to correct him on that.
I think the European Union has a view on it too, but there you are. They didn't like the look of it. It was illiberal. And I think it was described as illiberal and authoritarian. But there you are. We must understand. They want to hand over the Scottish nationalists our fishing grounds, our oil, our farming, over-regulation of business to the European Union, which will make Scotland even less competitive. In order to make Scotland economically sound and competitive, the Scottish Parliament cannot raise its taxes higher than the rest of the UK. The Scottish Parliament's powers must be limited to ensure that there is no constant clash with Westminster. Some competencies have to be run from the British National Parliament in Westminster, such as foreign affairs, defence, finance and business regulation. But they must also not conflict with the competencies in Holyrood. Heretofore, the Nationalists have not been cooperative with the Parliament of Westminster, and they will be punished for this increasingly by the Scottish people at the ballot box. The Scottish Parliament, currently under the SNP, continues to interfere in matters beyond its competence, such as foreign affairs, setting up duplicate embassies around the world. This is expensive to the taxpayer and a unnecessary waste of hard-earned taxpayers' money. Holyrood should not be pontificating about the Middle East or the latest tweet of President Trump, unless, of course, it's about destroying his golf courses putting useless German windmills all over his golf courses in Scotland. Tourists come to Scotland to look at mountains, not ugly German bird blenders. The Parliament should concentrate on infrastructure such as the neglected Forth Bridge and ways of helping Scottish business and not hindering it, such as the recent nonsense of minimal alcohol pricing, which will damage our whisky industry and will not stop people getting drunk. As a matter of fact, it'll push them into drugs and methylated spirits. So the whole thing is a daft notion. Fishing needs to be handled at UK level, according to most of our Scottish fishermen. Fishing is a UK-wide activity. Our fishing grounds should not be returned to the European Union, as the Scottish nationalists want, because otherwise it allows the Spanish and other foreign vessels access to our waters. We want to sell fish to the Spanish for their paella. We don't want them to make a smorgasbord of our fishing grounds in Scotland. That's
Point of information.
Is to be useful, it must work in lockstep with Westminster. Otherwise, we would be better off without it. I personally feel that properly run, in the interests of Scotland and her businesses and jobs, the Parliament can be a useful tool in the government of Scotland, airing grievances of hard-working ordinary Scots, which may be overlooked in Westminster, and acting as a forum for the Scottish people. If Holyrood is only used by the nationalists as a plaything to achieve their obsession of Scotland becoming a small province of an undemocratic European authoritarian superstate, the Parliament will not survive. Scots voted for Scotland to remain in the Union, knowing that there will be a subsequent referendum on the EU by Britain as a whole. We knew that when we voted. The Scottish nationalists have simply not got over the rejection of separation and Brexit. They simply must abide by the democratic result. Unlike Spain and the Catalans, the United Kingdom gave a referendum to Scotland and paid for it. That's how we do things in Britain. But when you have a referendum, you should abide by the democratic result. Otherwise, why bother? This issue is now settled, and we have a bright future in front of us, free from the undemocratic and economic sclerotic EU. Britain and Scotland are open for business to the world, buccaneering free trade deals with economically vibrant parts of the world, and not just with over-regulated, financially frail EU with dodgy Italian banks and crippling Orwellian authoritarian bureaucracy. Do we want freedom to be ruled by ourselves, or do we want to be ruled by bureaucrats? That's the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much to David for continuing for the proposition. We shall now move back to side opposition, and we have Dr. Luke Blaxall. Luke is a preceptor at Corpus Christi College who focuses on British politics from 1800 to the present day. Luke, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think I may cause some consternation on my side by saying that I am a unionist, and a very proud unionist at that. But this debate is not about whether the union should be salvaged. It is a debate about whether it can be salvaged. And with that in mind, that is what I would like to address most of my speech to. I think I can best undermine the proposition's case and further my own side's case by making an argument that is both Tory in the true sense of the word and Burkean, that the union is doomed, even though I would personally not wish it to be so. Now, my argument is that the United Kingdom is not something that exists somehow by default. It is a manufactured political community assembled in 1707, and if we look at Ireland and Northern Ireland, 1801 and 1922, and has been sustained through common bonds holding our four nations together. These common bonds have allowed us to sustain a single, unified political community prepared to accept pooled sovereignty within a kingdom where one country, England, would always be dominant. I'm going to show you exactly why these bonds that have helped sustain this political community and this pooled sovereignty are now greatly weaker than they once were and make the union extremely precarious. And I'm now going to show you that we have discovered in referenda precisely the weapon that will be used to remove this from its already precarious position. Right, first of all, on to some rebuttal. Now, I've been very amused by the first two speakers, which seem to, I suppose, revolve around crisis, not crisis, steady as she goes, governor. And I would say that within the whole word salvation is in and of itself an admission that damage has already been taken. We don't go around saying that things that are in robust health can be salvaged. No, we go and say, well, maybe it can be salvaged, if we just, put a few screws in there and patch things up or whatever that might be. That is not really something in robust health, something that is merely salvageable. We were told from Sir Malcolm Rifkind that the SNP were defeated in the election of 2017, despite winning 35 of the 56 seats. We heard from David Coburn that they thought they are not as popular as they used to be. These seem like rather feeble, rather timid kind of ascriptions of success. We seem to believe that because the SNP has gone backwards from where it was in 2015, winning 56 out of 59 seats, which was pretty much inevitable, there wasn't really much forward place for them to go, that means that they have somehow lost. Now, if we take as a general principle that going backwards means losing, we may also observe that Tony Blair would have lost the election in 2001 because his majority was only 167 instead of 179. We may similarly observe that the Conservatives lost the election in 1900 because their election was only 136 compared to 152 that it was in 1895. Correspondingly, we may also say that maybe Sir Malcolm Rifkind lost Edinburgh Pentlands because his majority in 1992 was not as large as it was in 1987 or in 1983. Simply going backwards doesn't mean that you have lost. And so there is a considerable degree of delusion upon the other side if they think that that isn't the case. We've also heard a lot about public opinion in this debate so far. Now, the thing I suppose with public opinion is that simply a referendum is something which can happen again. It's not something which is simply a detached, simple point in and of itself. In other words, there are transient political factors at the moment which may mean that the Unionists have managed to win this time, but those things will come back again later. It will be possible for other referenda to happen again, and the case may not be as strong next time around. We've also heard some other interesting speeches from the floor, some very romantic speeches from the floor. We've talked about things like shared identities. Yes, that would be nice, wouldn't it? But how will those identities be maintained? How will we foster a common sense of unionist identity within the United Kingdom if we are already in a position where the union is simply being salvaged? Go ahead, sir.
Well, I would ask how many people in this hall feel only English, or only Scottish, or only Welsh, or only Irish, or only Northern Irish. Most people in this country have more than one identity. So the groundswell, the foundations of that question on how we can be unionists are already answered. We are already multifarious in our identities. I'm part Scots, I'm part English, I'm from London, I'm also a student here in Cambridge. So your question is that how can we solve this question if we've already taken so much damage? We've already had the seeds of union sown in each of us. How many here are from only one part of this country? Very few indeed.
All right, sir, much as I would love your romance, much as I think these things are absolutely wonderful, it is nonetheless a highly intellectual case. Now, we'll now proceed to my substantive arguments on why the union is doomed. But first of all, I will say one point in response to David Coburn's about the SNP destroying the ability of Scottish people to read, write, or add up. I think that we should therefore be very confident that obviously the Scottish people in future referenda will not be able to read their ballots, will not be able to fill them in, and then the Scottish people won't be able to count them anyway. So in that case, we would have nothing to fear from future referenda anyway. So therefore, there wouldn't be any point really complaining about future ones. All right, definitely on that point.
Well, probably because they're all left to avoid Scottish income tax by the SNP. Because in England, it would probably be lower.
Well, indeed. Well, then the population of Scotland will be zero, and there'll be no one to vote in your referendum anyway, so it won't matter anymore. Scotland will be reclaimed under some called of squatters' rights by ever who happens to be still there. Right, now my substantive case. So I'm going to make some points now on that the structural and cultural factors underpinning the Union are much weaker than they used to be. The first one I would like to talk about would be empire. Now, empire traditionally was a huge political project which united England and Scotland and the other parts of the United Kingdom. Now, we can say that even though cultural expressions of nationalism in Scotland were strong in the 19th century and the 20th century, politically Scottish nationalism in this time was weak. And so therefore we may ask, why exactly was that? I say that it is because there was a common political project which united the sister nations as one thing, which was the British Empire. This doesn't mean that it was good or bad, it simply means that it existed. Now the empire has disappeared. Now there is no longer that common political project. It is now unsurprising that there is not the same sense of political project, sense of political journey that will also keep the Scottish people within the United Kingdom and committed to that particular journey. In other words, the Union is not something that just simply exists. It is an active political project. And when there is no mileage in that political project, obviously, there isn't anywhere near as much of a reason for both sides to remain in it. The next thing, the next thing, another bond, the faith in aristocracy and the monarchy. Fairly obviously, this is something that united Scotland and England in the past. The Scottish aristocracy being something that was responsible for the government of the United Kingdom, responsible for empire, and the distinct Scottish connections of the monarchy. Clearly, the faith in the monarchy is highly dependent upon the current reigning monarch, Elizabeth II. It's questionable whether it will increase thereafter. That's another bond which is weaker. Another one is about class. Now, we can say that one of the common bonds for collective bargaining power, trades unions, the Labour Party, which united working class people in Scotland, England, and Ireland, the whole of the United Kingdom, was this common class identity. Now, this might seem like something very romantic, but the fact that Ravenscraig steelworkers in North Lanarkshire may have felt common identity with those in Port Talbot, shipbuilders on the Clyde, having common identity with those on the Merseyside, miners in Ayrshire feeling commonality with those in Durham. This class solidarity and this class identity, which was manifestly so important through much of the 19th and 20th centuries, is something which clearly bound people together, bound the working classes together, wherever in the United Kingdom they were. With the decline of social class, the decline of these heavy industries that inspired those class loyalties, another bond which bound the United Kingdom together is correspondingly weakened. We've heard a lot about the EU today. I won't say much about that, merely to say that clearly the principle of bartering sovereignty, diluting sovereignty to give some sovereignty away to the European Union, and Scotland being as pro-EU as it is, inevitably will mean that people within Scotland, or some people, will conceive of their identity as being partly European and as well as partly part of the United Kingdom as well. Okay, since I am running very, very low on time, I'll skip entirely the point about devolved assemblies, merely to say that clearly the fact that we have devolved assemblies in Scotland has also manifestly weakened some of the links that we would have with the United Kingdom. Who is the real representative of the Scottish people? Scottish people will have to, obviously are asking themselves, is it my MSP, is it my MP? Is it the case that, is Tory austerity being fostered on me from England? Is English Brexit being fostered on me? Is even, the poll tax, is Scotland being seen as a laboratory for English issues? There is always that fundamental disconnect there between who is my real representative. And that has occurred because the Scottish Parliament was placed there. Those who thought that would strengthen the Union were myopic faddists. They did not know that actually it would weaken the Union considerably when that happened. And then finally, referenda. Okay, so we now have established that the Union is in a position where it is very, very weak. We now have established and legitimized as a principle the perfect wrecking ball mechanism whereby the Union can be tipped off that already precarious precipice. So with referenda, let's look at them. We've had a lot of referenda in recent times. We've seen, obviously, a referendum on the European Union, referendum on Scottish independence. They are now part of the way we think about politics. So with referenda, the date can be held at any moment, the right time, even as my colleague says herself, the right moment can be chosen for a referendum to win on one day. It needs to win only with a majority of one. You can stoke a protest vote during one as well. And so for all these reasons, if only on one day in all of a 300-year history, a day that is at the choosing, very often, of the change makers, a referendum can be won, that places a very, very low bar on what is required to bring down 300 years of history. So in this case, I've shown you that the bonds which automatically have brought the Union together and have maintained it are much weaker than they once were. And at this precise, and there is now the perfect mechanism, the perfect siege weapon to destabilize that Union from its already weakened position. So, to sum up overall, that is the state of play. The position is very weak, and we have this wrecking ball of referenda as established and legitimized within our Constitution, which is exactly the weapon that is required to tip us from that unsteady precipice. For that reason, we may wish to take a leaf out of the statecraft of our forefathers by observing, for example, in the Great Reform Act of 1832, that the then British ruling class believed that it was better to jump ultimately before it was pushed, to be able to make the reform in its own terms rather than to allow change makers to make it then. So I would appeal to the unionists in this room, or the people who really value whatever aspects of the union can be salvaged, or that just simply want to see common bonds of loyalty, even outside of the United Kingdom, that unite Scotland and England continue, then it may be better, if we believe the arguments that the end of the Union is inevitable, to negotiate that on our own terms, rather than have it done in a sea of nationalism at a moment the SNP choose for themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luke, for continuing for side opposition. We'll now return to the proposition and to Liz Smith. Liz is a Scottish Conservative politician who is the member of the Scottish Parliament for Mid-Scotland and Fife. Liz, the floor is yours.
Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, can I first of all say what a pleasure it is to be with you. And it's a particular pleasure for me as a member of the Scottish Parliament. And that is something that I have had the privilege of being for 11 years now, over a very different Parliament in all 11 years. And I want to relate that experience that I've had to this debate this evening. And I'd like to start by offering the view that I believe that not only is the Union salvageable, but also that it can be a force for good. And I'd like to suggest that perhaps the power of the Scots themselves will be the determining factor, though obviously the views of other people in the United Kingdom matter a very great deal too. And I'd like to start with your own generation, because at the time of the 2014 referendum, and I did a lot of debates in Scotland at that time, as did many of my colleagues on both sides this evening, your generation, if I may say so, and that included 16 and 17-year-olds at the time, was extremely articulate. And you spoke a lot about very passionately, about what mattered to you. And largely that was an economic argument for many of you. Yours is a very global world. And I think you see things slightly differently from previous generations, and good for you, because I think that we need to look at what that generation wants. And it was very interesting at the time what 16 and 17-year-olds were saying, and then if you look at the demographic trends within the referendum result of the 19 to 24 age group, there was a very high proportion of young people who wanted to stay in the Union. And I believe that they did so largely for economic reasons. And I say that with a bit of evidence. And I want to use some of the SNP's own evidence about this, because I don't think that the SNP managed to make the most convincing case when it came to economics. They were a very, very powerful party. They still are. And they make very convincing cases in some issues. But when it came to the referendum on the economy, they didn't manage to do it. If we listen to Kenny MacAskill, former Justice Minister for the SNP, he said that the Nationalists made a fundamental error with the pound. We couldn't decide whether we wanted the pound or the euro, or to be pegged, or to have a completely different currency, something that Alex Salmond raised himself. When it came to issues about the border, Alex Neil, well-known Scottish nationalist, he said that too many people had issues about the border. What was going to happen to industries like finance or defence? Or to Andrew Wilson, leader for the SNP when it comes to economic thinking. He said that the SNP put far too much store on the price of oil, and therefore there was that fundamental problem for the SNP. Now, I think that many people in Scotland saw the SNP as having a much more appealing civic nationalism, and that's what attracted a lot of people to vote for them. But within that civic nationalism, I don't believe that that has carried over into a lot of policy conviction, because despite the SNP coming out as the single biggest party, as they did, very convincingly, in 2016, they did lose their majority. And that has changed the Scottish Parliament. And now people are starting to judge the SNP, not on independence. And I come back to the point I raised with Joanna Cherry earlier. There is no overall increase in people who want to have independence, nor indeed is there any increase in the number of people who want to have a second referendum. And I think that's very significant in Scotland. What there is, and this is very telling in the Scottish Parliament just now, is a demand that the SNP delivers as a Scottish government. Now, I've sat through many years in the Scottish Parliament now, and I've witnessed a big change there, where the SNP was doing exceptionally well. Particularly the Scottish Tories couldn't hold a candle to them in terms of their internal discipline and the way that they put themselves across in Scotland. And everybody knows what happened to the Scottish Tories in that time. Now, however, thanks to Ruth Davidson and to many different factors, the Scottish Tories are a much bigger force in the Scottish Parliament than we have been at any stage. And that's, I think, quite significant in terms of what's happening to political thinking in Scotland. Because just of the recent past, the SNP have found it very difficult indeed to convince people in Scotland that they can deliver when it comes to education, when it comes to health policies, when it comes to a lot of economic policies, particularly on tax. And that's something that's coming home loud and clear to the Scots. Now, can I also deal with this issue about identity? Because whilst I think your generation sees a lot in economics, the identity issue, which was raised by our Liberal friend up here, it's important because the identity matters. And I think it is very important that we see ourselves as Scots and as British. There is no binary choice for me, not at all. I'm proud to be Scots, very proud to be Scots, but I'm also very proud to be British. And as Sir Malcolm said, it's about your head, but it's also about the heart. And not only is it about ensuring that we have that diversity and that choice, it's also about ensuring that we can live together as a united kingdom. I think we have much to learn from each other. We have much strength because of who we are. That diversity has enriched Scotland, it has enriched England. And many people are very comfortable with that. In fact, I think most Scots are comfortable with devolution. Despite all the huffing and puffing on both sides, whether they're nationalists or whether they're unionists, and let's be honest, there's lots of huffing and puffing that goes on, most people deep down are very comfortable indeed about that dual identity. And for unionists, we're proud of that. And I think that really matters when people are making their decisions about how they're going to vote. And I particularly think it's true of your generation. So my point would be that when it comes to the argument about the union not only being salvageable, but being a force for good, I believe very strongly that we are powerful because of being united. And we are enriched because of the diversity in that. It's been mentioned by two speakers on both sides about what happened in 1707. Of course.
Though, when further devolution would erode that salvageability? Or is there a point where the process would simply have to stop? And if so, where would that be?
No, I think it's important that further devolution actually enhances that. Because I think what the Scots really want to have is the best of both worlds. They want enhanced devolution, which, as time has gone on with the Scottish Parliament, that's what they're getting. They want it to work well, and I think it is starting to work well. People are comfortable with the Scottish Parliament. Despite what some people might think, they are comfortable with it. They want it to work well. And therefore, I think enhanced devolution, but I don't think that's exclusive to having a strong United Kingdom. I think they go together. And that's my point, that I think this union, this United Kingdom, in a very uncertain world, and let's be honest, Brexit has made it more uncertain, and international events have made that more uncertain. That's where I think the United Kingdom, irrespective of what all the arguments are just now, deep down, there is this philosophical belief that people are stronger together. Yes, sir.
That devolution in itself has actually strengthened the United Kingdom since 1997.
Yes, I do, because I think that it's taken away a lot of the strains that the Scots have felt aggrieved in some ways. They haven't got that argument any longer, and I think that's a very important thing. I think Scots are more comfortable in their skin, if you like, than they have been for some time, and I think that's a powerful thing that can put together our politics and bind it in a way that perhaps was not going to be the case had that not happened. Because, let's be honest, that there were times where it looked as though it was a choice between nationalism or the status quo. But I think as devolution evolves, that becomes something that is much more appealing to the Scots. So may I finish on my last point? This union has stood the test for 300 years. Despite all the warts and all the troubles, and my goodness, there have been lots, whether it's the partition of Ireland or whether it's the fall of the British Empire, 2 world wars. And in Scotland, it actually survived Thatcherism. And that was something that many people thought might not happen. But it has. And I believe very firmly that it will survive Brexit. And not only will it survive Brexit, but it will be stronger in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for asking me to come here, and I'm very happy to support the motion. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, Liz, for continuing for side proposition. Now on to side opposition, and we have Tasmina Ahmed-Sheikh. Tasmina is a prominent SNP politician who was the MP for Oakhill and South Perthshire from 2015 to 2017. Tasmina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam President, and of course to the Union for this invitation. The last time I spoke on this subject was the Oxford Union, so it's a very great opportunity, I know, to have the chance to speak with you. And before I launch into some of the main points I want to make, although you may not agree with what myself and my colleagues here feel about an independent Scotland being the best way forward, I think after listening to the speech of David Coburn, you might understand why we might think it's a good idea to escape the kind of unionism we have heard in his speech earlier. It is interesting that the motion states that the union is salvageable. This rather presupposes that the union is worth saving. It's not. For a union to sustain, it has to have logic. And it's my submission that that logic is no longer there. Way back, the union was in place to allow these islands to turn a common face, a joint face, to the rest of Europe. Now, there are clearly radically different attitudes to European development. Way back, the logic of the union was to secure a common economic area. Now, the union threatens our trading prosperity. Now, every day we see papers full of remarks about Remoaners for disrupting the Brexit process and refusing to accept the democratic decision of the British people. Never has 52% of the vote held such potent power, it would seem. On that premise, though, what about the 62% of people in Scotland who voted to remain in the European Union? Interesting to hear comments from the floor. The Liberal Democrat gentleman there speaks about respecting mandates. Yes, we do, and yes, we did. The proposition, however, has changed. The UK is no longer what it was in 2014, and that just one second, and that must be remembered. I think the gentleman also mentioned about respecting the mandates and not demanding further referendums. Unless Liberal Democrat policy has changed, I believe that was his party's position in relation to the Brexit referendum. I'll take the point of information.
Thank you. Concerning whether Scotland will move towards independence, I thought it was interesting that a lot of the voters who voted for independence chose subsequently to vote leave in certain areas of Scotland, and that might, in a sense, cancel out some of the voters who voted for, for the Union and then voted remain. So I'm wondering, at this stage, isn't politics very unpredictable? I mean, Jeremy Corbyn's coming north to the border and getting a surprising amount of support, so isn't it quite difficult to make a concrete kind of prediction that unionism is on the decline in Scotland when it's actually a lot more unpredictable?
Well, I'm grateful for your point of information. And there is no doubt that politics is unpredictable. Who would have thought that the UK would have voted to leave the European Union? Who would have thought that President Trump might win that election? And it's true that people have differing but very valid views on what the union between Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom and the European Union. I do, however, take issue with your suggestion that Jeremy Corbyn is getting lots of support from people north of the border. That has not manifested itself in any election yet, and certainly doesn't manifest itself in the Scottish Labour Party support for him. A point was made here earlier about whether Scotland would be welcomed into the EU. An interesting point, because Scotland's brand is really very valuable in the European Union. Very highly thought of is Scotland. Why? Because we respect the European Union. The language we use around the European Union is positive. I would just ask that the gentleman that made that comment think about what the EU27 might currently think about the United Kingdom, about our antics or inability even to negotiate anything relative to a Brexit deal. So what is in... Of course.
I had a chat with President Juncker and various other people in the European Parliament, and they actually are as much interested in having an independent Scotland as they are of having an independent Catalonia in the European Union. The European Union do not want to balkanise the United Kingdom or anywhere else. So they have no interest whatsoever in Scotland becoming a part of the European Union. It is nonsense to suggest otherwise, and President Juncker only saw Nicola Sturgeon as a matter of, as you see any of the Prime Minister of the German Länder, he did not do any business with her, and there will be no deal for Scotland, and if we did, a remote circumstance, if we did a deal, we would have to go in without all the tax rebates, so it would be a disaster for Scotland, and we'd also have to have the extreme austerity in order to get the Scottish National Party catastrophic economy under control. And you keep on talking about austerity. You'd have austerity max if you were in the European Union on your own.
Well, I'm grateful to the gentleman's mini speech after having had the floor himself. What I would say is this, I think President Juncker might be greatly concerned if he thought that the Honourable Gentleman was his spokesperson on earth. So let's just leave that comment where it is. I too have met with President Juncker, and I would say that I don't think his views are reflected even slightly in what you have just pontificated. Let's move on into what the Union of the United Kingdom means for Scotland. Why should we exist in that union if we are to be ignored? David Cameron's legacy will forever be the disastrous Brexit vote, and no amount of Conservative spin will ever change that. The term compassionate Conservative has surely got to be one of the greatest oxymorons of our time, and not a title that Cameron deserves, when the compassionate thing to do would have been to put some more effort into saving Britain's place in Europe. That may have saved the union of which we speak tonight. The British public has been sold what we say is a pig in a poke. The support for Brexit is one of the biggest double bluffs of all time. Take back your country, cry Rees-Mogg and Johnson, and we will free you from the shackles, a word often used by my honourable friend, of the EU. We will take you out of poverty and hardship. Jacob has even compared leaving the EU to famous turning points in British history, such as the Battle of Trafalgar and the signing of the Magna Carta. Rees-Mogg and Johnson are the masters of the rhetoric of the empire. The establishment played a very clever trick last year, ladies and gentlemen. Persuade the electorate that a vote to leave the EU is an anti-establishment protest vote, while installing the very epitome of elite Britain as the main champions of it. Not so, of course, in Scotland, where the electorate saw through this farce and want other options for our country's future. In the chaos of Brexit came indeed the voice of reason. The first voice of reason why nobody dared leave Downing Street to make a statement came from the First Minister of Scotland. And then, of course, And then, of course, came June's snap general election. The Tories in Scotland campaigned on no to IndyRef 2. That was what they campaigned on. My point is, and the point has been made by Sir Malcolm Rifkind, about the importance of parliaments across these islands. There is support in the Scottish Parliament for another independence referendum. That parliament is full of parliamentarians democratically voted in by the people of Scotland. It is an irreconcilable viewpoint that it's okay to have a Scottish Parliament so long as you don't listen to what it decides to do democratically in votes. That just doesn't stick. Democracy must prevail. Now, the Prime Minister recently, and rather funnily, suggested that Scottish independence has, I quote, gone away. Gone away. It's not up to Nanny May to chide the children up north, nor is it up to a branch manager in Scotland to tell the people that the conversation on independence has been shut down, I quote, once and for all. How out of touch can she be? And what is the alternative to Theresa May? An unruly and bombastic Boris may yet be in charge, complete with his diplomatic foot stuck as ever in his mouth and his phone on speed dial to himself or Michael Gove. If this union is salvageable, what would Scotland be like under Tory rule at Holyrood? That's not something the people of Scotland have experienced. We'd have talent being prevented from going to university due to crippling tuition fees, a crumbling NHS due to further privatisation. The list lengthens, and I've only now been given 1 minute because I was so generous to my colleague on the opposing side. The Scots have not forgotten how Labour joined forces with the Conservatives in a Better Together campaign and lied to the people of Scotland. They told us, vote no to independence if you want to remain in the European Union. That was a lie. The truth has now come out. We don't want Brexit. We don't want to leave the single market. We value freedom of movement, and we don't want nuclear weapons on our soil. And as Boris Johnson promises to make a titanic success of Brexit, the ship Britannia looks set to sail over a Brexit cliff. And there will be so little left to salvage, much like this union. So as you make up your minds this evening as to who you may lend your support to, I ask you to consider this. If we were currently 4 independent countries deciding whether we would come together or should come together to join a union, would there be a single persuasive argument for that to be the case? I think not, and I therefore speak against the proposition. The union, in my view, but for name alone, is over.
Thank you very much to Tasmina. I believe that a couple of our guests do need to go at this point to make it to the station, including, it's either up to you, James, if you are able to speak now, I won't take a floor round, or alternatively, if you do have to take your leave, not at all, we can...
President, I'll speak.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Extremely briefly, really for 2 reasons. Very briefly. First of all, an extraordinarily lively and comprehensive debate. I think almost every aspect of the argument has been covered so well by many of my colleagues who come before me. But secondly, I want to speak very briefly because I'm catching the train shortly. My taxi is waiting for me outside the front door, and I'm going to have to go and catch it. I do apologise to Madam President and you, ladies and gentlemen, for that. The debate, I think, on the most has been a very extraordinarily good one, although slightly focusing on only one aspect of it, namely a revisiting of the debates that were held so well in Scotland in 2014. And the debate actually tonight is not about Scotland. The debate tonight is actually about the Union. I very nearly offered to speak on that side of the debate this evening because the motion, of course, is the Union salvageable? That indicates the Union is somehow or another collapsing and needs to be salvaged. I don't believe, Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, that is the case. My strong conviction, I speak as a Scot, a son of Scotland, a son of the Mans. My father's moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, a graduate of Glasgow University, Glasgow High School. You don't get more Scottish than me, but I have for 42 years lived in England representing the good people of North Wiltshire. We believe strongly in North Wiltshire that the union of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland Scotland, Wales and Ireland is the most powerful unit that we can possibly have of government, and that without it our nation is weaker and poorer, and that we must not allow it to disappear. And now my interpretation, looking round England and leaving Scotland entirely on one side, is there's no threat of any kind at all to that union. I'll go one stage further, Madam President, that is this. I'm a very strong Brexiteer. I argued very passionately and campaigned very hard to leave the European Union for a very simple reason. I believe that one island, of one culture, of one history, of 65 million people, all sorts of different cultures, of course, in that island, that is a natural unit of government. I do not believe that 753 million people across the continent is a natural unit of government, and I do not believe that a country of 4.5 million people north of the border is a natural unit of government. I believe that Britain, together, looking forward, as an independent from the European Union, I believe that Britain can once again be truly great. And I believe the union isn't salvageable. It doesn't need salvaging. I think the union is the best thing we've got, and I very much hope that you'll vote in favour of it this evening.
Thank you very much, James, for continuing for the proposition. I'm sorry you didn't have longer, but thank you very much for your remarks. We will now, I think, go to a final floor round. It will just be 1 point per side. Would anyone like to make a point in proposition of the motion? And Callum will be the final speaker in the debate, so give him points to which he can also engage with. So firstly, in proposition, if I just take the one just here in the brown jacket.
We've heard a bit of, Owen Gill, flown in from Gutton. I'm also a Lib Dem, so the pandas are in trouble now. I'd like to speak a bit about logic, because you've heard a bit about logic tonight, and I'd like to point out the sort of cognitive dissonance in the position of the SNP, in that we'd like to take sovereignty back from Westminster, only immediately then to give it to Brussels in the form of the EU. And moreover, that we will listen to Scotland in the 2016 referendum on the EU, we won't listen to Scotland in the 2014 referendum on Scottish independence. Moreover, I think there's a comparison to be drawn between the Leave campaign, the Brexiteers for the EU, and also the Leave campaign, the Skexiteers for Scotland. I think that when we say that the EU must give Britain a good deal because it's in the EU's interest, we also hear that the UK must give Scotland a good deal because it's in the UK's interests. I think that at this point, the SNP have become the sort of intellectual equivalent of UKIP.
Thank you. And now a point in opposition of the motion. Ooh, again, lots. No one upstairs at all? Okay, I'll go to just on the right-hand side here.
My name is Luke, I'm from King's, and I'd like to respond to what the second speaker on side proposition has said. First of all, your obsession with German windmills. Build better ones, sincerely, a German. And second of all, I find it weird that a UKIP member accuses the SNP of an independence fetish. Now, on to the actual substantive. You mentioned currency and that Scotland leaving would destabilize the pound. Now, who caused the initial fall of the pound in late 2016? I think there was a vote in terms of independence for the entirety of the UK, which initially brought about this uncertainty in the first place. And I think you can hardly blame Scotland for taking your route alongside that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, there's the right to reply.
I'd like to respond to that. The pound falling has actually been good for Britain. It makes our exports better. What could be better about that? The currencies go up and down. The problem with the currency for Scotland is there wasn't one. Was it bobbies? Was it old thruttly bits? Who knows what they were going to use? Wampum, perhaps. But the long and the short of it is there was no solution to that, and there is no solution. And if they did have independence from the EU, they would have an enormous problem because the EU would come down like a ton of bricks and make them have austerity max. And Sturgeon forever bleating about austerity. She wouldn't like it. I don't know about Tasmania. She used to be a Tory, so maybe she'd be keen on that. But the Salmon would not, and his successor would not be in favour of austerity max.
And I think there's a right reply from Joanna, then I'll go to the abstention points. Joanna.
As we seem to be somewhat in the minority, I'd like to take the chance to reply to some of the points that have been made from the floor. But I'd start by reminding Mr. Coburn that one of the greatest British politicians, in fact the saviour of this country during the Second World War, changed parties and crossed the floor of the House. It's an honourable man or woman who has the guts to admit that they've changed their mind, and that's simply what my very dear friend Tasmina did. David, you're spouting economic nonsense. It's what we're used to in Scotland, but I feel I need to explain for people here what's so wrong about your argument. The pound being crashing down, as the gentleman at the back of the room there explained, is not a good thing for the economy. I'll tell you why I know that. You're one businessman. I've spent the last year with the Exiting the EU Select Committee travelling around the whole of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland, listening to businessmen and indeed businesswomen from across the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. They vastly, in the majority, think Brexit is a bad thing. People in Britain don't just export, they import. Take Sunderland. The cars that are made there are largely put together with bits and pieces which are first of all imported. Now, many silly things have been said this evening. And I'm sorry, I don't wish to be patronising towards my audience, but I do wonder whether some of the speakers actually listened to a single word I said. I am not ignoring the mandate of 2014. My point is that things have fundamentally changed. I'm sorry, I thought I was a reasonable speaker, but the whole point of my speech was promises have been broken that won that referendum, and things have fundamentally changed. I do respect that mandate, but things have changed, and I think the people of Scotland should be given a chance to think again. Now, I'm not actually in the middle of a floor speech, so I'm not going to take any points of information, but I just want to correct something else. Somebody said we are a United Kingdom of the region. Sir, I do not represent a region. I represent one of the most ancient nation-states in the world. Scotland is not a region, it's a nation. I would be delighted if London came with us. I'm very fond of London and I'll miss it greatly when Scotland becomes independent. I'd love to bring Brighton, Cambridge, Oxford, Manchester, all these, yes, remain voting cities. Please come with us. Please come with us. Scotland's not about being a Scot. It's about a different vision of how to be a modern Scotland.
And with that, we'll move to points in abstention, and then we'll return to the debate finally. Are there any points in abstention of the motion? I will take one just over here on the left-hand side.
Michelle, both sides have been concentrating on the past in both referenda that have taken place. And yes, this provides the historical context for where we are now, but this motion is about the future of the Union. And the greatest proof or disproof of its salvageability is how that can or cannot happen.
Thank you. And finally, to speak as the final speaker on side opposition and in the debate as a whole, we have Callum Worsley. Callum is a final year medical student at Emmanuel College. Callum, the floor is yours. Tom.
May I say, before I launch into this, how pleased I am as a long-term resident of this House to see such lively giving and taking of interventions such as has not been seen in this chamber for some time. Congratulations to all. Back when I was a second year, when I was asked to propose Scottish independence in this very hall at short notice, as I suspect the only Scot with experience of debating that could be found at such short notice, I was opposite Dame Anne Maguire, as she is now. Back then, she was my local MP. Fast forward 3 years, I find myself in oddly similar circumstances, standing in next to several of my elected representatives. We have David Coburn, MEP for Scotland, Liz Smith, MSP for my region if I'm staying with my dad, and Joanna Cherry, MP, if I'm staying with my mum. If it is that this question is to be litigated for several years to come, I look forward to mine and my MP's future invites. The motion, as it's been worded this evening, is not the neutral question that was posed 3 years ago, but rather paints a picture of an inexorable slide from no to yes, that Scottish independence is somehow inevitable unless today's side proposition can salvage it. Where once the onus was on our side to break the union, it's now incumbent on their side to save it. And I think that's astutely done by the President this evening, because that's the way this debate has been transformed in the years since the referendum. I don't get to have much Scottish independence chat around here because the Scots are relatively few and far in number, apart from this evening. And I spend much less time in Scotland than I would like to, but I can see this even among the conversation I have with my English housemates. Back in 2014, their questions were, why would you do that? Why would you go independent? Why would you want to leave, throw away your stability? You're not different to us anyway. Just stay. Now even their questioning has changed. Worsley, when is Scotland going independent? When are? Worsley, you must be proper annoyed at this Brexit thing. Indeed, when Theresa May tweeted the other day, the UK and Scotland must continue to work together to ensure businesses and customers have the certainty they need as the EU, next to a picture of her and Nicola Sturgeon shaking hands. One of my friends was quick off the mark to text me saying, I hope this isn't a typo, and Nicola's negotiated independence on the sly. The slide is inexorable, and even those with only a Scottish friend to claim as their link to the debate realise it. And this all started once the 2014's debate was done. I remember getting up early to watch the referendum results with my mum in 2014, and watching as David Cameron appeared outside number 10 to claim victory. In doing so, he sought immediately to bring the conversation back to England and to continue appeasing the rest. What does this vote mean, he said? English votes for English laws, he said. And the better togetherness promises that we had seen in the weeks gone by seemed to melt away. As I went into the hospital that day and talked to students and doctors, even though there was a strong no bias among those among which who I hanged around, there was a sense of deflation. It felt like we'd scored an own goal, like what we had voted for was not what we were getting, and that was day one. Fast forward 3 years, and many of the arguments that were most persuasive have fallen away. Vote for stability, vote for staying in the EU, they said, and what of that? Let's deal with some of what we've heard from this debate and from the floor. We've heard from Tasmina and Joanna about how the reality of the situation has changed utterly. And although Sir Malcolm may have spoken about what might be seen as the disappointment of the 2017 election, forgetting, of course, that the 2015 election, in the aftermath of the independence referendum, was one where the SNP swept all before them, winning 56 of 59. The new groundswell of feeling behind the Scottish National Party cause started that day and has accelerated to this point, seeing as we do that they're the only ones prepared to stand for Scotland without being beholden to their majority English counterparts. And this need not be the old chestnut we heard from over here, that this is about gerrymandering electorates, that we're a bunch of lefties, England are dragging us to the right, and that the SNP would cease to function if Jeremy Corbyn became PM. That's nonsense. This isn't about that. It's not about just making sure we live our own way, though living our own way certainly in the domain of health, which I'm most familiar, has done Scotland no harm under several governments of several colours in Scotland. Far from this being a debate about whether the prevailing wind should be centre-left or centre-right, all the stuff about the power of small countries with forward-looking plans is far more important and is lost in the bickering of a few quid here or a few quid there. After all, neither Labour or the Conservatives seem at all concerned about spending several quid here and there in the name of Brexit. So let's have a discussion about the referendum, or referendums have been mentioned during this debate. Perhaps if the Yes campaign might have done better if they'd had the benefit of foresight to see how to win a referendum, a la Leave, lie, lie, lie. And don't we all believe, with the exception of my friend in the corner, that we have been lied to? Don't the people of Scotland feel lied to in the promises made to carry the Better Together campaign over the line? Just a second. Vote for stability. Vote for the EU. Vote for jobs, investment, you name it. How many of those have Tasmina and Joanna shown will disappear under the current state of affairs?
This evening we've heard a lot about lies in Brexit, lies from the no side in the referendum. Can we please just for a moment address the Scottish Government's white paper, which the economics in it is complete nonsense, completely misled. Forgive me, I don't have the figures to hand off the top of my head. Complete nonsense, and it's been shown to be, it was a complete lie. Can we please address that as part of this spirit of lies?
I think it was, as someone who was relatively neutral, sort of on the fence in the original referendum, I thought it was eminently reasonable of the Scottish National Party to consider putting 670 pages of white paper together to allow the Scottish people to make a decision on that basis. How many pages did the Leave campaign provide? How many pages have they yet to provide now they've had 18 months to do so? Okay? The Scottish people were provided with a way in which to make that decision. Whether or not they weighed that right, whether or not the information in itself was right, we have shown now that it's acceptable to do major constitutional change on the basis of no pages of anything. So either that's useful, in which case you should be grateful for it, or it's not required, in which case we should proceed either way.
Scots voted to remain against Brexit was because the Scottish National Party and government spent an absolute fortune of taxpayers' money trying to persuade them to do that. More than happened in the rest of the UK. And the same happened with this white paper. It was a lot of nonsense. And as for promises, the Conservative Party may have made promises, but UKIP most certainly did not.
I mean, yeah, as well as what they've said, I would make exactly the same point to you as I made to my friend over there. Like, did the Conservatives, have the same... is the same illegitimacy cast on the Brexit referendum by the fact that so much taxpayers' money was spent on that as well? If you ask the people a question, it's only right that they be informed about it and be allowed to make their choice in a reasonable manner, as I think can be said firmly to have been done far better by the SNP than by any of the protagonists in the Brexit campaign. So even the concerns we had heard here raised by Liz about these missed goals on the border, on the pound, are they not worthwhile concerns about Brexit if we are merely to stand and take these as the inevitable results of Brexit? So we should have no qualms about taking these as the consequences of Scottish independence, if the ends are worthy of the means. And even if Brexit isn't worth the hassle of putting up with all this nonsense, perhaps you think that Scottish independence is. And it's not such a great stretch to assume that it might. Whatever you think about the question of whether the Union should be saved, how on earth can the Union be saved when all of Scotland looks back on what we were promised when we had this debate in the past and sees the rest of the UK in complete contempt of everything that we have been told and promised in the past? For were another referendum to happen now, all the most persuasive arguments of the No campaign would hold no sway in the post-Brexit vote world. All my friends and colleagues who felt so much on the day after the referendum that they had missed an open goal might think a different way. So might many yes voters might see now what they think of as the error of their ways and think differently. But if this question were to be raised again, the principled arguments of the yes campaign will hold far more sway than the discredited ones of the no's. And whether it's in the next 5 years, 10 years, or within my lifetime, where I hope to live and work in Scotland for a long time to come, if the life of the Union is once again at stake, I believe it cannot be salvaged at all. And I'm grateful to Madam President.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Callum, for closing the debate. As ever at the Union tonight, we will be voting by our feet. The only thing left to do is to thank all of our speakers, including the one who had to leave us early, and just to say thank you also to everyone for making so many points to the floor and for engaging so much tonight. The motion before the House is, this House believes the union with Scotland is salvageable. If you vote by your feet and exit out of the right-hand door to vote with the proposition, exit out of the left-hand door to vote with the opposition, and exit out of the centre door if you'd like to vote in abstention. Thank you very much for coming along tonight. And thank you for side chairing. Thank you.